Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Jason and I are here today with Peter Allen of Mastodon Valley Farms. We're going to start by having Peter introduce himself, talk a little bit about what he does, and then get going with the conversation. Welcome.
Cool, thanks. I'm Peter Allen. I have a farm here in southwestern Wisconsin. I've been here about 10 years. And I started actually in the university teaching and researching ecology, and specifically restoration ecology. And my focus was trying to figure out how do we restore sort of functional ecosystems. A lot of the traditional restoration and here in the Midwest is focused around restoring sort of historic plant communities like the tall grass prairie, but take an approach that's sort of divorced from the historical context that the ecological context that those plant communities were in. So you'd spend a lot of time fighting invasive species, and then you walk away, and then nothing in the context changes, and then you're right back where you started from, and you've spent all this money, and you've sprayed all this herbicide, and there's like really no good that comes out of it. So I was really trying to struggle to understand here in the Midwest and across large portions of North America, the historic ecosystem kind of from the east to west was the oak savanna for a very long period of time. And oak savanna is an ecosystem with it's a grassland ecosystem. So it's a completely grassland system with scattered trees. And it happens to be the ecology that produces the most food, both in terms of fruits and nuts, but also meat in the form of all the herbivores that it can support. And so I kind of realized in the university that the only way we could really restore these systems was to do it in a way that actually produced food. And I was kind of at a point in my career where I had to make a choice. I could either become a tenured professor and write papers suggesting that farmers do what I think because I'm a super smart guy with my PhD, or I could quit the system, get land, and see if it works. Like I basically, for my dissertation, I developed a model for a farm based on the functioning of oak savanna ecosystems. So instead of publishing that as an academic work, I decided to prove it in the real world first. And then if I'm successful, maybe I'll publish something with it. But if it's not, then at least I don't have to waste my time. So that was 10 years ago. I quit the university and started a farm. And I figured if we're going to do this restoration at scale, it's got to be economically viable. It's got to produce a profit. It's got to support a livelihood. So our mission here from the very beginning has been to restore sort of highly functioning ecosystems as the context for a profitable farming enterprise. And nice. A byproduct of that is food that's much healthier and more nutrient dense than anything you can buy in the supermarket. So
yep. Cool. I'm just curious now that you mentioned the restoration ecology. Do you know Dow O'Ryan at all? She wrote the book Beyond the War on Invasive Species.
I've read that book. We're not personal friends.
Okay, she's in the Doomer Optimism universe. Cool. She's been on before, and she's got that same kind of attitude. Like she didn't realize when she went into it that it was just like spraying so many herbicides, and right. She was like, "This is horrifying." Yeah. And I think this is pretty central to the kinds of things a lot of us are interested in, which is like upending what is like common knowledge or common practice with regard to like what are ideal ecosystems. So I'm wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about like some of the misconceptions about like what is the best or most functioning ecosystem. I think thinking about it historically is really useful, because I think there's like a weird mix up between like what we think of as pristine ecologies and like different historical periods. Like what I know in a lot of restoration ecology, there's like some date that people are like trying to recreate, but without any of the context of that date.
Right, and typically that's before Europeans showed up. That's sort of like the last point in time before there were Europeans is sort of the goal of most restoration projects, which is fairly arbitrary.
Yeah, what is
There were
behind
tons,
that, do you
there were
think?
tons of, and the problem is, and the issue with that is that there were tons of people at that time, like a lot of human beings doing a lot of things on the land. So there's a paradox of trying to restore something that's pristine, but it wasn't pristine. It was highly managed and manicured. And so that's why it doesn't make sense. They go and do all this restoration. They plant all the species, the native ones, and they try to get rid of the invasives. And then they walk away and don't do any active management, besides maybe killing some invasive shrubs that keep coming and coming and coming. But there's no context for that management. And it just is a huge waste of time. And so I find it really helpful to think about ecology in as long of a historical period as your brain can kind of muster. And so, and thinking of ecology as that ecosystems undergo evolutionary development as well as species. So we know that species tend to get more complex over time, going from single-celled organisms to multicellular, for example. Ecologies, ecosystems evolved in tandem with the development of individual organisms. So as individual organisms evolved more complexity, ecosystems developed more complexity and function, the ability to transform solar energy, sunlight, into animal biology, into cells, into production. And so that has gone through time. It has increased over time. And so the further back in time you look, the more primitive those ecosystems are, the less functional. Like if you go back to the like early dinosaur era, when it was, just some ferns and some, proto pine trees, there wasn't like a carbon cycle developed. We didn't have a lot of the decomposers yet. That's why we have so much coal and oil, is because all this biomass was growing up and dying, but it wasn't being cycled, like turning into soil the way we do, because we have a complex ecosystem that has evolved. So forests were the first major ecosystem type on land. And so forests developed before there was any herbivory. So there were no brontosauruses eating tree leaves yet. And so the ability of animals to eat plants was sort of the beginning of a more functional ecosystem, because that started the carbon cycle, because an animal could eat those plants, transform it through its body, and then defecate, and then create a carbon cycle that would then build soil. And so forests are fairly old and immature ecosystems. And so as life developed, especially starting 30 million years ago, so 60 million years ago, the dinosaurs went extinct, the whole planet was in disarray. The plants grew back finally, but higher animals there were like none. It took 20 million years for a mammal the size of a squirrel to evolve. And then by 30 million years after that, about 30 million years ago, we start to have herbivores that are eating tree leaves. And then about 25 million years ago, we get the horses that developed the high crowned molars that were able to actually chew grass. So grasses had evolved back at the very, very end of the dinosaurs, but there was no such thing as a grassland. Grasses were just a little understory plant. Nobody could really eat it because it had developed this defense against herbivory, because it had this silica. It was really difficult to consume. And so it took mammals a long time to figure out how to do that. And then once horses came on the scene, very shortly after that, we get the development of the rumen and ruminant biology to be able to actually get really good nutrition from grass. And then evolution exploded, and we've got camels and elk and these giant deer and the giant bison and the horses and all of these animals that are grassland herbivore obligate, like they have to have grassland. And so you have the development of these animals that are eating grass, and then you have these giant herbivores like mastodons and ground sloths that would eat trees, like eat giant trees and take them to the ground. And that would allow, in these more humid areas like the eastern United States, which is a lot of moisture, if you let land go east of the Mississippi, it turns into forest in a fairly short order without any kind of disturbance. And what kept that from being forest historically for the last 20 million years is the herbivory of large megafauna. And so up until 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, a lot of the eastern United States was open savanna grassland, not a closed canopy forest. And once the end of the ice age, we had the Younger Dryas period, which was a major catastrophe. All the megafauna essentially went extinct, and then all those forests grew back up because there was nobody to manage the forests anymore. And Native Americans came in and they started clearing it out, and they were using fire to manage the forest, and they brought back the grassland. And so the anthropogenic grassland, the Native American created grasslands, were a little less diverse than the previous megafauna managed grasslands, but much better, much higher diversity than a forest. Because the savanna is a more evolved ecosystem, it's a higher ecosystem, it has way higher diversity, way more complexity, and way more productivity. So from a human's perspective, as an indigenous person, you wanted a savanna because you had way more meat, way more nuts, way more fruit. It was just a better ecosystem to be a human in. And so the Native Americans managed it as savanna all the way up until the Europeans showed up and drove the natives out. And then anything that we didn't, that our ancestors decided not to plow, that was too steep or whatever, it was often grazed and maintained savanna for a while pre-World War II, but definitely after World War II, anything that wasn't very productive arable cropland was essentially let go and reverted back to a more historic, a less diverse, less ecologically functional ecosystem state, which is a closed canopy forest. And there are some contexts. I'm not a hater on closed canopy forests. I love closed canopy forests. Old growth forests are amazing, and there's a lot of diversity in there. But we don't need to necessarily cover the whole planet in those, because we couldn't support very many human beings, for one thing, in that context. And there's a whole cadres of species that are now rare and extinct. All the grassland birds, for example, that have gone extinct or almost extinct because there's no grasslands left. Everything that was open grassland has been converted to cropland because grasslands are the only ecosystem that create topsoil. Forests create a humus layer, and that humus layer over maybe 1,000 years can grow a little bit, but it doesn't actually build soil. The grassland ecosystems of the central United States grew feet and feet and feet and feet. There are places in Illinois that are 20 feet deep of pure topsoil. And that's from the accumulated activity of herbivores grazing plants. The grass grows back, it gets grazed, it gets grazed. Every time a grazing event happens, grass roots slough off just a little bit of the bottom parts of their roots. That feeds the microbes in the soil, which creates more soil. And so they're actually, from the bottom up, building soil at a fairly rapid pace relative to a forest. And so realizing all of that is what drove me into saying, well, let's try to build a farm around all of these principles of the oak savanna.
Okay, I have two clarifying questions, and then I want to let Jason go. One, is there any limit to the amount of soil you can build up, or is it just like it can just keep going up?
Under appropriate management, I mean, there's always, nature could bring a drought or lower the productivity for some reason, but there's really okay, here is what brought about the limit to building soil in the grasslands was the 100,000 year ice age cycle that started 3 million years ago. So there was no ice ages, well, way back, but not since higher life forms evolved. There weren't ice ages until 3 million years ago. And this is at the peak. 3 million years ago is at the peak of biological and ecological evolved activity on planet Earth. And we developed a lot of topsoil. And what the glaciers do is they come and plow all that up. And a lot of the carbon, topsoil is soil organic matter, which is carbon, gets oxidized into the atmosphere. So there's potentially some feedback mechanisms when you're thinking sort of global climate scale things. But and it's also, I think, it's an interesting note to ponder that the period of the highest amount of mammal diversity and the highest ecological functioning on planet Earth happened with a carbon dioxide percentage in the atmosphere up 500-600 parts per million. And then when the ice age came, it plummeted down to 300. And so 300 is like ice age conditions on Earth. It's just an interesting.
Yeah.
I want to get into that, but you go, Jason.
Well, there's so many threads that I want to pursue here. I guess one, since we're talking about climate, so oftentimes ruminants in particular get a bad name because they release methane into the atmosphere. And what we're talking about here is that, well, if they're managed properly, they can sequester a lot of carbon into the soil. This is assuming that we think, increasing greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is creating climate instability, which will create a lot of problems for us. Perhaps even people talk about potential extinction events, things of that nature. But how do you relate to kind of that kind of mainstream narrative about climate change and the role that animals, especially ruminants, play in contributing to climate change? And how does something like, methane go in the atmosphere? Like if we were just to fill all the grasslands and the plains with animals, a lot more methane, but probably also a lot more carbon sequestered if we did it correctly. Like, how do you see that balance, that trade-off? And how do you see it in the larger picture of what the climate is doing and what is suitable for human thriving?
Well, how about I'll just say this, that during the Ice Age, up until 10,000 years ago, in North America, there was about 300 parts per million CO2. At that time, there was grassland ecosystems in North America all the way across from coast to coast, and there were more ruminant herbivores. There was more biomass. There was more animal flesh being produced in North America then than there is today. And we didn't go, the CO2 didn't start skyrocketing because there were, bison and elk and mastodons and all these animals. So that's just like a fact. That you
Wait, that includes humans?
That's herbivore biomass. That's like
herbivores.
That's like total meat being produced on a yearly basis. There was more throughout the Ice Age in North America, just naturally than naturally. Of course, humans were modifying the ecology, but not so much in the Ice Age. Actually, I'm going to take that back. It's not humans, because humans weren't even. There's arguments that there were actually humans here along the coasts, like in California coast, 200, 300,000 years ago, all the way through the Ice Ages. But besides that, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that there was large-scale human populations during the Ice Ages in the continental interior of North America, in which it was animals doing all the work, and we were producing as much or more meat then than we do now under the modern system. And so there's clearly, with that fact, there's clearly something we don't understand about the carbon cycle and the role of herbivores, because that just doesn't make sense in the current narrative of what drives climate change. So that piece of evidence to me just states that we've got some learning to do, like that there's something there's some fundamental facts of nature that we haven't figured out yet. One kind of piece that might play into it is that there's quite a bit of research now showing that in healthy grassland soils contain methanotropic bacteria, which consumes methane on the surface of the ground. And so that any methane released by the animals would get immediately converted and turned just into nitrogen by soil bacteria. So there's potentially some mechanisms as to why we didn't have runaway climate change, a million years ago. But I think there's more to the story that we're not aware of yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, I think oftentimes the critique of animal agriculture is specifically industrial,
for sure,
concentrated animal feeding operations, things of that nature, which I think is pretty clearly bad for us, bad for the environment,
bad for everything, bad for the animals,
it injects a ton of carbon via fossil fuels at every step along the way. It's not just the cow eating the grass that causes the carbon to be released. It's all the other stuff.
In my understanding, the worst part of it from a carbon perspective, if you're going to limit the discussion to like carbon as a consequence, is in the growing of the grains to feed the animals. And
Yep.
the oxidation of carbon in the topsoil and then the loss of topsoil via erosion is way worse than some farts and burps in a feedlot. Now,
Yeah.
you know, farts and burps in a feedlot at a mass scale probably isn't good either, but of all the negative consequences of CAFOs,
Mhm.
I would put cow farts and burps at like the bottom. I mean, it's animal welfare, the you know, the horror that we're doing to the land to grow the grains to feed those animals, and then the poor quality food that then has negative health impacts in humanity. Like all of those things to me are, you know, if you're going to you know, prioritize those, you know, carbon would be kind of at the bottom of that list, but you know, maybe that's not good either. But that's conventional,
Yeah.
which is an aberration. I mean, there's been nothing like that in the history of the earth until 1970 or whatever. So, I mean, I was vegetarian for like almost 10 years because there was no other option. I just couldn't bring myself to eat that stuff.
Yeah. So relatedly, and I think this is also related to the industrial paradigm, is you hear all these statistics about how inefficient meat production is with regards to inputs and water use and you know, land use and things of that nature. And you know, so even people who are, say, interested in agroecology or permaculture or whatever, you know, a lot of them argue, well, you know, we're still going to need to cut down a lot of our meat consumption either way because of these inefficiencies. And I'm wondering if we say want to be able to feed, you know, current global populations or whatever. And I'm curious what you think about that. Is that a legacy of the industrial paradigm and it hasn't accounted for, you know, basically this alternative paradigm that you're talking about of functional ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different ways to slice that, but essentially we can grow. I mean, like for example, at our farm, we've got about 220 acres. About half of that is steep wooded hillsides that we can't really utilize. So we've got about 100, 110 acres of pasture, and 90% of that is on land that's way too steep to do any conventional agriculture on. You could never plow it. So we're growing almost all of our meat on unutilizable land. Like we're not taking food out of the food supply. We're actually adding food to the food supply that wouldn't otherwise be there without animal grazing. And so, you know, regionally, the answer to your question is going to look a little bit different. You know, if you're in central Illinois, any land is going to be potentially arable cropland. So if you're taking it out, you know, potentially there's less total calories that you could grow if you're just doing, say, rotational grazing versus growing corn to then feed to cows in a feedlot, right? Potentially there's fewer calories. However, where it gets really interesting is when you start bringing in the ideas of permaculture, because there's really not much of a limit to how much calories any person can grow on, say, 1 acre. You can always add one more perennial plant that's going to give you some kind of yield and maintain open area for grazing. And so the problem with that is that that is a human labor intensive way of growing food. So if you're just looking at a comparison of like grass-fed beef to growing corn to feed cows in a CAFO, sure, that you might be able to make an argument that it's less efficient to do the grazing because you can grow more calories.
Like legumes or something else.
Sure, right, but yeah, right. So legumes, sure, you could say that you could grow more calories if you were using, you know, diesel tractors to grow legumes at scale in an industrial model versus a grassland with cows. But the cool thing about the grassland with cows is that you can keep adding things to that system that produce more and more and more and more food. Whereas with the industrial model, you can't. There's not even room for earthworms in that industrial field. Like there is no life in those fields. You know, an industrial lentil field or a bean field is dead biomass. There's nothing there. It's not even soil. It's a substrate that is used to grow a plant of questionable nutrient benefit. Whereas a grassland ecosystem, you can add sheep, say, with your cows, and you can graze the same amount of cows. You just get sheep in addition to the cows. And then you can throw in some goats and you can have a horse. You can then start planting trees like we do. We've planted over 10,000 trees here of fruit, but mostly nut trees, hazelnuts and chestnuts and acorns and walnuts. And so there's depending on how you make the comparison, you can definitely make the argument that you can grow more conventionally with an industrial ag system. However, on a theoretical way, you can actually grow way more food than that. You just need more human labor instead of one guy and a giant tractor.
Yeah. If you don't mind, Ashley, I have a follow-up here.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah. No, I think this is fascinating. This is a topic that I think comes up a lot is what productivity means. And oftentimes in the industrial paradigm, it's labor productivity with big machines and a lot of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
It seems like what we're talking about here it does require a paradigm shift, because it's, first of all, this idea that 1% of the population is going to be involved with food production doesn't seem really ideal in my opinion, or viable. It seems like if we're going to accept our role as stewards, as perhaps even keystone species, many more of us are going to have to be interacting with landscapes and managing landscapes partially via food production. And it seems like a lot of mainstream environmentalists don't really like that idea. They want to kind of keep this pristine wilderness over there, keep all the people packed in the cities because, I don't know, lower carbon footprints apparently, or whatever.
Supposedly, yeah.
Supposedly. And a lot of people are resistant to the idea that we're going to need a lot more land managers, aka farmers. I certainly think we do, and I promote that, but it is a paradigm shift. It's like, hey, everybody, if we want to actually be sustainable, quote unquote sustainable, if we actually want to be in harmony with ecology, we have to interact with ecology, and we have to do it in a way that makes sense, which is actually managing animals and being productive as well, to for it to be actually financially sustainable, et cetera. So I'm curious what you think about just this shift in our whole kind of paradigm from, say, restoration to regeneration, or however we want to frame that shift.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we need a paradigm shift at every level of our thinking about everything. And so if we don't, we're going to die. Like we don't have an option to like not shift our paradigm. If we don't shift our paradigm, we're not going to survive. And so, yes, we have to shift our paradigm. Like that's exactly it. And to me, it's there's so much in the modern environmental movement, like nihilism, that comes out of like, well, there's all these forces out of our control, and like climate change is happening. There's nothing we can do about it. So, and especially with climate change, because when you pin it on climate change and carbon, right? Like as a mammal, like what do you produce every day, with every out breath?
Carbon.
Right. So if you want to solve the carbon problem, what do you got to do?
You should die.
Right. You got to kill all the breathers, all the useless breathers. Right. So like, I don't like going down that thought path. That's not helpful to me. But when we realize that not only can we be keystone species, we already are, whether we acknowledge it or we admit it or we embrace our role or not. If we go to McDonald's and eat a cheeseburger, we are causing rainforest deforestation in the Amazon for soybeans to be planted to feed the cows that then made that burger. So like we are causing landscape change with every meal that we eat, every snack that we eat, every time we chew something up and swallow it, we are causing landscape change. We don't need 100% of humanity to be landscape managers, but we sure as heck need more than 1%.
Yeah.
It's going to be somewhere, I think to have something reasonably sustainable, we need somewhere between 1 and 10%. I think if we had 10%, we'd have plenty of people managing the land to grow plenty of food. We have plenty of land on planet Earth to feed a lot of people. Yeah. We just need to manage it correctly. With water, there's just so many ways with humans on the land using our brains not artificial intelligence. It might be useful in some situations, but like humans using their brains can grow a tremendous amount of food with essentially no inputs. Like you don't need fertilizer. Yeah. Now, in some places of the world, it's a lot harder to get started. If you're in, you know, in the Saharan desert, obviously, like you need some stuff to get started. But once you get a system going, and if you're in a green place that has biology happening, you can utilize existing natural biology to kickstart any kind of a productive enterprise. And there's not much of I mean, there is some theoretical limit to how many calories you could produce on an acre of land, but it's way higher than any of us have ever, like there aren't 1 acre properties on Earth, at least not very many, that even come close to approaching what that would be. Partially because it takes multiple human beings being cooperative to achieve that, because there's only so much that any one person can do.
That's the difference between like the productivity that industrial agriculture touts, which is this labor productivity, but it's completely unproductive with regards to land productivity and resource productivity or efficiency, you could say. And I think that's just a small fact that most people don't understand when they say, oh, you know, how are you going to feed the world with, you know, without industrial agriculture? Well, more people just have to get involved with being landscape managers. Like,
well, the world just has to feed itself. It's actually really simple to feed the world. The world just has to feed itself.
Yeah.
You can't expect somebody else to grow all the food for, you know, the entire world. In like 2 places. It's like in, you know, Central Asia and the Ukraine, and then here are like the bread baskets of the world, and we're like supposed to feed everybody. Like that doesn't even make any sense.
So I wonder if you might, I've heard you speak about this before, but really lay out the case for humans as a keystone species, what we might do. And I know you like oak savannas, but does that vision change depending on where you're at in the world? Like, you know, what is the Peter Allen solution optimism look like?
I think, so there's a few questions there. So if we're just talking about the keystone species thing, you know, it's kind of an arbitrary, you can make an argument that any species in any ecosystem is a keystone species. It's, for some species, it's a lot harder of an argument to make than others. Some are pretty simple. So classic examples would be like a wolf. And if you take the wolf, and basically the definition is any species that has disproportionate influence on the functioning of that ecosystem. In that, when you remove that species, the ecosystem changes character in some fundamental way. If you remove a wolf from an ecosystem that has a lot of grazing animals, those grazing animal populations will explode without the wolves there to keep them in check. They'll outstrip all the vegetation, eat way too much food, and then they'll collapse because they won't have any food left. And so then you get in these really extreme predator-prey cycles if you remove keystone predators. In the eastern United States, the oak tree is one of our top keystone species. It feeds, like that one species, the white oak, Quercus alba, feeds more species of animals and birds than like any other species comes close to. I mean, it's tons and tons and tons of animals and birds rely in a very fundamental way on the white oak species, the acorns. And if you remove that tree, which is happening across Eastern North America right now, the oak is not regenerating for a whole bunch of reasons. The fundamental character of those ecosystems are changing as a result, and it can't support near as much wildlife. Deer and turkey and grouse and, you know, all kinds of birds that can no longer, and going back a little bit further, we had the chestnut, the American chestnut, which was the most common tree in Eastern North America, and it produced even more calories per tree and per acre than the oaks do now. So it was even more of a keystone species that we lost, 100 years ago. And so, but humans are obviously now, we are the keystone species, whether we admit it or not. It just so happens to be right now that the action, like we are a keystone species that is supporting, it's hard to even call it an ecosystem, but it's like the most dysfunctional ecosystem on planet Earth, in planet Earth's history, really. I mean, you wouldn't have had a period of, except maybe when the glaciers came and wiped away a lot of the soil, but you wouldn't have a time where with so much fertile topsoil that had accumulated through the results and the activity of biology happening, herbivory in particular, that just got wade laced and allowed to like run off into the oceans. Except for maybe the glaciers, but that happened over a very long time scales. It wasn't just instantaneously everywhere on planet Earth that has fertile soils. It's now draining off into the oceans. And with that, you know, going back to Jason's question about the this comparison of the industrial paradigm to a new paradigm, it's that, you know, the byproduct of regenerative agriculture is topsoil. That's the byproduct, which means that we can feed future humans indefinitely. The byproduct of the industrial system is no soil, like it's gone. And not only it's gone, but then the substrate is killed, the biology is destroyed, and you can bring that back, but it takes a long time. And so you're setting yourself up to be reliant on three things in particular, and that's nitrogen fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer, and potassium. And with those three things, you can grow your crops on dead soil. But that can't last forever, because nitrogen we can make with energy. If we have free energy, or we have the ability to burn stuff and to make electricity, we can make nitrogen. It's fairly easy. It's very energy intensive, but it's straightforward. Phosphorus is it's a rock, and we're mining it at really fast rates, and we don't even have more than 10 or 15 years of phosphorus left on planet Earth for industrial agriculture to even keep happening. So it's almost a moot point as it is. Like, it can't keep going. It's like we either turn the ship now on our terms, or we wait until it's too late.
Mm-hmm. So what can we do? You know, I mean, we had this, I don't know if you are familiar with this man, Neil Spackman.
Oh, yeah, I know Neil. He's back. He's actually been here before.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So we had him on, and his optimism, I think, was like the most off the charts of anyone. Would you agree, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think his optimism in terms of what the potential was, for sure.
Yeah, and he was just like, I mean, if we did this paradigm shift, and if we all started regenerating ecosystems, and he's doing aquaculture,
yep.
The potential for ecosystems to provide is just, it's not even, we can't even fathom it yet. I mean, it almost feels like infinite relative to the way we think now. So I'm wondering, do you have a similar level of optimism about what we could do if we shift our thinking and paradigm?
Yeah, I'm super optimistic. I mean, that's what I was saying before, is like, there's hardly even a limit to how much food you can grow on an acre if you're really trying. And so I'm not even remotely worried about feeding the world. Like, the world can feed itself. Like, that's not even very complicated or difficult. You know, the hard part is sort of like in between our ears, right? It's like, it's our brain, it's our knowledge, it's like our pre-programmed thought patterns that hold us back. And I'm super optimistic in the long term. It's the short to medium term, and like how we get there.
Yeah.
That's, you know, there could be easier and much harder ways of getting there. I'm hopeful for an easier way, but like, I'm prepared for a hard way.
Yeah, that's basically our whole podcast, is like, can we just do this before it gets scarier? I have one other question I want to ask, just because he's an ecologist, but then you can go, Jason. Okay, so I'm a sociologist. I try to understand ecology, but I thought that there's this idea that humans cause the megafauna extinction.
There's a theory. Yeah, that overhunting, it's the overhunting hypothesis.
Where do you stand on that? Because I feel like so many people's idea that our humans are necessarily destructive hinges on that theory.
I don't buy it. I don't see a lot of, it requires this sort of, like, we certainly could have like killed a lot of animals, but to make massive herds go extinct from a population of humans, like, new to a place, like they had just come here, and literally within a very short amount of time, they went extinct. But the thing is they went extinct everywhere at the same time. And so the timing the timing is synchronous, but it happens way too fast to be a reasonable explanation, in my opinion. Mm. It would have taken, I think, with their tools and technologies, and they were hyper advanced hunters, like they were very impressive, and the quality of like the points that they made has only decreased over time. Like the quality of points that were made, 500 years ago are just a tiny fraction of the quality that was made, 10,000 years ago. I mean, just phenomenal handiwork to make these tools. But still, I mean, we're talking massive herds of massive animals that would have been driven to extinction in like less than 100 years over all of North and South America at the same time. It would be easier to believe that if at that moment in time, during that 100-year period, wasn't the Younger Dryas event, which caused massive, massive earth changes over all of North and South America simultaneously. I mean, the biggest floods that anybody's ever even thought about all happened like in an instant. What it looks like is that somehow either a comet hit the glaciers in Canada and North America, or maybe a solar flare or some projectile from the sun instantaneously vaporized those ice sheets, and then they drained down North America, okay? And so we had this just massive catastrophe, and in an instant, all those larger animals are gone. In an instant, right. They're gone. It happened to coincide with the arrival of people.
Right.
So if there wasn't just abundant evidence of this catastrophe in every geological strata at that time, like you see just this huge event that happened, if that wasn't there and there was no evidence for a catastrophe, then like maybe I could believe that humans did it. But because there was this mass catastrophe, and it could have been that humans had set back the population a little bit, so it was harder for it to bounce back.
Right.
The traditional explanation is climate change, but every single one of these species had lived through ice age cycles on 100,000-year cycles. So every 100,000 years you have an ice age, and then you have a 10,000-year interglacial and things warm up, and then boom, another ice age for 100,000 years. And then for 3 million years, this cycle has been going back and forth and back and forth. And these guys were just fine. They did not go extinct. And then all of a sudden, 12,000 years ago, they went extinct. So people, climate change, or a catastrophe, or some combination of those three. But I don't think people could have done that amount of damage in such a short amount of time. And there weren't that many of them. I mean, they spread across, from the time they crossed the Bering Strait, they were in like Tierra del Fuego in like no time, right? Within like a few hundred years. It's phenomenal, but not in numbers.
Right.
Right? There weren't thousands and thousands and thousands. There wasn't 1 million people that crossed the Bering Land Bridge and then scattered out and then just overhunted everything in like a generation.
Right.
Maybe that happened, but to me that seems wildly not very possible. Unlikely.
Yep. Sorry, Jason, one other ecology question, and then we'll like move on to other things. Do you think that we can thrive? Do you think that ecosystems can thrive, or that humans will be okay? I don't know, like just that everything will be okay at 500 to 600 parts per million. Like, what is your take on that? I mean,
I think it'll be just fine.
That's like that. I mean, that's like sacrilegious to say, I think, in environmental circles. But I'm like,
I unplugged from environmental circles 10 years ago, so yeah. I guess I don't realize the level of hearsay. I'm just speaking of my
from an ecology perspective. Yeah,
based on looking at historical records, we had peak diversity on planet Earth at 500 to 600 parts per million. So I don't see a fundamental reason why we can't have peak diversity again. Yeah. I mean, we've lost a lot, so we got a long way to go. I mean, once the megafauna went extinct, that's the thing a lot of people don't realize. The megafauna went extinct, but then so did all the species that relied on the megafauna, the dung beetles and all the birds, and I mean, huge ripples of extinction. So in geological time, we talk about like we're in the middle of a mass extinction now due to humans, but really we're just continuing the extinction that started in earnest 12,000 years ago. in a geological time, 12,000 years is nothing. And so it's all part. I mean, when you look in the back, there's been 6 major mass extinctions in history, and all those took place over thousands and thousands and tens of thousands and even hundreds of thousands and even millions of years. I mean, very long drawn out periods of time. So we're still in the same mass extinction event that started with the loss of the megafauna.
And like everybody wants to just blame every single thing on climate change or like increasing parts per million in the atmosphere. And I think that's it just can be like a little bit myopic. And even when there's evidence to the contrary, like every storm is climate change, every flood is climate change, every, you know, biodiversity loss is climate change, when in fact it's like much more complicated than that. Sorry, Jason, you can go.
Yeah, I mean, I want to push back on both of you a little bit. To me, it's not just average temperatures, it's the stability of the climate in relation to current human settlement patterns, right? So I don't doubt that 500 or 600 parts per million, much warmer, wetter world, it would be thriving with life. I'm just not sure it would be thriving with human life or human life where it currently exists without mass extinction of humans and mass migration away from certain areas and all of the geopolitical conflict that surrounds that.
Well, here's a counterpoint to that, and I don't disagree with you. And I think there are fundamental challenges that we face, and the climate is changing.
Yeah. Right.
The climate is changing, and that's going to cause problems. The question is, what's the cause of that change, and what can we do about it? Like, how can we mitigate that in any way? Yeah. But just as a counterpoint to that, because I would 100% agree that scenario is horrific and we want to avoid that if possible. However, there's another scenario that we likely would be in right now, and that is what I just talked about, which is this 100,000 year glacial cycle. We have 100,000 years of ice age where the glaciers come all the way down into middle America. And then we have this 10,000 years of interglacial. Well, this 10,000 years of interglacial that we've been in started 12,000 years ago. So by all accounts, we should be in an ice age right now, or at least transitioning towards an ice age. We should be getting into an ice age right now. So one question would be like, would that be bad for humans too? Would that upset a whole lot of people and current settlements to have a march of glaciers from the north and coming down and from the south coming up? I would argue that yes, that would be very bad for humanity, and really in fundamental ways decrease the total amount of food that we could produce on planet Earth. At low CO2 and at low temperatures, you just can't grow very much food. Whereas at high temperatures with high humidity, you can grow a whole ton of food. You can support a lot of people. Yeah, they might have to move around, but you can still support a lot of people. In an ice age, there's just not that much food you can grow relative to like large population sizes. So that's one potential outcome of global climate change is ice age. And you could also make the argument, and I'm not making this argument, but one could look at the existing data and say, well, why aren't we in an ice age right now? And could it be because we've been burning so much carbon dioxide and warming, and that's actually prevented us from entering an ice age? Yeah. I have no idea. My sense is that carbon plays a much smaller role in climate change than we give it credit for. That would just be my guess.
Yeah. So two things. One, it seems like there's a difference in relative timescale. Like with climate change, greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, it seems like this is a timescale of like, okay, the next 100 years is do or die. Whereas ice age cycles, it seems like there's probably, correct me if I'm wrong, it's more probabilistic. There's an error term of probably thousands of years. Right. And so,
but that doesn't mean that things don't change fast when they change.
They change fast when they change, but we don't know if that change would happen, now or 1,000 years from now. Right.
Right. And what's to say that we have any kind of a confidence that shit's going to hit the fan in our global climate system only because of CO2 over the next 100 years.
Right. So,
I mean, that's what some people are saying, but I'm saying, like, how do we actually know that that's the case?
So this brings me to my second point then. So let's say that your theory is correct. Doesn't that undermine the whole case, at least from a very narrow carbon perspective of regenerative agriculture, right? Because the whole selling point of regenerative agriculture is, hey, we're sequestering carbon from the atmosphere where we don't want it into the soil where we want it. And of course that has many other ecosystem benefits, and there's all, so, but if we're just talking about the selling points for climate change, right? And people like Neil Spackman, people who are interested in regenerative finance are interested in, like, carbon is the big money player of, like, you can pay people to sequester carbon and it'll have all of these knock-on ecosystem benefits. But if your theory is correct, that undermines the whole case for regenerative agriculture from that perspective. No?
I mean, that's not, you can make that case for regenerative agriculture as a reason. And if everybody's so myopically focused on carbon that that's the only metric with which to make decisions about what to do, right, then I suppose, but there's so many benefits. Like, I didn't come into this because I wanted to sequester carbon. I came into this because our ecosystems are dying. And if they die, we die. It's not that, like, it might get warm and we have to adapt and move off of the oceans because the oceans are going to rise and move inland. That's not why I got into this. I got into this is because if we don't heal our ecosystems now, we're not going to be able to survive as a species, period.
Okay, devil's advocate. Say you got into this for, for functional ecosystems, for the whole holistic case. As a side effect, you're sequestering carbon, and say this movement takes off, we're all sequestering carbon, even though that's not our prime intention. We inadvertently bring on an ice age.
Right. And then maybe we should talk about, plowing up the land and growing some corn for a few decades. I'm serious. Like, that, I would love if that was our problem. Like, that was our problem as humanity. It's like, we've done such a good job at restoring ecology that we're bringing on another ice age, and we kind of don't want that. It's like, okay, let's solve that problem. Like, that's awesome. I want to be confronted with that problem. I would be just thrilled if that was the major problem that humanity was facing right now. Our ecosystems are just too functional. We just got to plow some shit up. Like,
I know. Well, I just feel like to just make a meta comment, like, I just feel like the conversation about regenerative agriculture and climate change and all of this stuff is just like so midwit, and like, and no offense to everybody else, but Peter's just like at the Jedi level thinking about, like, I mean, the first 10 minutes he took us through, like, the history of evolution to make the case for why he's farming the way he's doing it. It's very hard to get everybody there, though. So I think it is useful, Jason, like, so, I mean, to your point, like, if everybody's just focused on carbon, and if that's what gets them to do, like, regenerative aquaculture like Neil's doing, or regenerative agriculture like Peter's doing, fine, and then there's so many positive other effects that it's fine to use that as the way, me as a sociologist, like, recognizing the social landscape to get us there is fine. I wonder if I can switch gears quickly to ask you what is going on. So I have a friend who lives in the Driftless region, Josh Helling. I know Mark Shepard lives there. Another friend of mine, Zach, lives there, just moved there. Like, what's going on in the Driftless? Is there like a regenerative ag? Like, tell me the social landscape around you. And I'm also curious, like, are you getting people clued in and, like, more customers? Or do you think there's more people getting into this kind of farming? What's going on in your region of the world?
It's interesting. I really like it here. So for people that don't know, Driftless just refers to the geology of this landscape, which did not get hit by the glaciers. So we're up in Wisconsin, and so we had glaciers come through all the ice ages, came around us. So went east and west, and then joined back together south of us. And so there were this region of southwestern Wisconsin and southeastern Minnesota, and a little bit into Iowa and Illinois, that never got hit by glaciers. So we actually have a very ancient landscape. So I'm on the Kickapoo River here. The Kickapoo River is one of the oldest rivers in the world. There's some debate among geologists. There's another river in Africa that's also very, very old. It's hundreds of millions of years old. This landscape is ancient, and it's very interesting. There's a lot of hills and valleys, so it's surrounded by flat land, and so different types of people migrate and live here than live outside, and so it's got a very interesting social situation. There's a lot. The area that I live into, about 20 minutes away, is where a whole bunch of hippies moved in the 60s and 70s, kind of back to the landers, and they started Organic Valley. And so Organic Valley's corporate headquarters is 5 miles down the Kickapoo from where.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And because of that, these two counties right here have the highest concentration, the highest number of organic farms of any other counties in the United States. And so that's pretty cool, but that's like kind of on its way out. Like the whole organic movement, in my opinion, is starting to fade a little bit as it gets gobbled up. I mean, there's basically just, it's an industrial system now. So at least on the small scale side of things, these small farmers, I grew an acre of acorn squash for Organic Valley one year. And that's just not economically viable really anymore, because there's such big players in the organic game now. So anyway, but there's a really interesting culture. So you've got all the kids of the hippies out here, and then you've got the local rednecks, and then you've got Amish, and we're all in it together. And I think there was a lot of conflict back in the 70s and 80s among these three groups because they're so different, but now they've all figured out how to live together, and we all work together. I just went and picked up a batch of hogs from an Amish friend of mine. So it's a very interesting social dynamic out here.
Yeah.
It's a great place to be from my perspective. Like, just in case there's another ice age coming, I think I'm in a pretty safe spot.
And also, you said you can't do arable ag there, which Jason and
not much. I mean, we do have it, and the hilltops and the valley bottoms. There's a lot of so we're a dairy farm central, and we used to have tens of thousands of dairy farms in this region, and now we're down to like the hundreds because they just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and everybody keeps going bankrupt. And so the fundamental farming ecology is in the middle of a big shift right now as these legacy dairy farms are all going down. And ironically, it's kind of weird. Land prices are going up, so they're kind of selling off in chunks to people from outside of town, from the cities. Everything's changing right now, so it's kind of interesting. I don't necessarily like a lot of those changes, but there's nothing I can do about it. Like it just is what it is. It's changing.
Is it just like city people are buying the land and not farming it?
No, I would say that when city people buy farming land, they lease it to the nearest industrial farmer.
Okay.
So the total amount of agriculture isn't changing. And unfortunately, the cool thing about the dairy farms is this was an area back in the 30s and 40s that Aldo Leopold actually came out here, and they created part of the Soil Conservation Service created this contour farming scheme with all these hills where they would do strip crops. So they would do on contour a strip of corn, and then a strip of alfalfa, and then a strip of beans. And then they would rotate through the years which strip would be which thing. And so the cool thing about that is that every year there were strips of alfalfa, which is a perennial that will at least slow down the soil erosion happening from up above it and accumulate some of that. So at least there's some perennials in the landscape. It's not ideal, but it's way better than when the first Norwegians showed up here and were plowing down the hills with their horses and plows. And we had the most erosion you can imagine. I mean, the hills up here lost their topsoil and the valleys accumulated. We've got our valleys are 20 feet higher off the ground than they used to be because of all the hilltop soil that came off with the original farmers up here. But anyway, with the loss of the dairies, a lot of that strip crop ground is just going to corn. So it's unfortunate we're starting to lose more soil because there's less of that alfalfa integrated into the mix because the dairies are going down. So, yeah. And then socially, and in terms of like our customer base, that's kind of an interesting situation that we're in right now, in that a lot of our customers are sort of, left politically, environmentally minded, wanting to do the right thing for the world. And they're getting such a barrage of what I would say is misinformation of like plant-based. If you want to heal the earth, you gotta give up meat.
Yeah.
That we haven't lost a lot of customers to that yet. But I'm a little nervous because such a large percentage of our customers are in that sort of target demographic of that propaganda.
Yeah.
So, or at least most susceptible in the most susceptible demographic. And I've lost a few, but we have a lot of demand for our product. So like, I'm not worried about like not losing but not having customers. It's just a matter of transitioning to different customers. So
I have a couple questions, and maybe take as long as you want. One, I just kind of want to know more about the details of your operation. I assume you do rotational grazing with like kind of silvopasture, and feel free to fill in details. But second, I also want to know, like, we've talked about this kind of the direction that we need to go in. Do you have a theory of change of how you think that's likely to occur? Like for Ashley and I, we kind of see, slow motion collapse as kind of the driver of change, where suddenly energy prices go through the roof, fertilizer prices go through the roof. People are suddenly food insecure. They have to start producing food, like that there's kind of these macro drivers that we think are likely to drive, if we are going to get to regenerative land management that are going to drive it in that direction. But I'm curious if you see kind of like, what is your theory of change of how you think that would be most likely to occur? So both kind of your operations and then how you see it spreading, I guess, is one way to pair those two.
Sure. So yeah, we do, for our operation, we do rotational grazing of beef cattle, sheep and goats. We don't have any of those right now. I'm taking a break until I can get some new, better fencing put in. And then we raise hogs and pastured poultry. And so then our economics, the way we make it work is through a meat CSA. So, which isn't, we call it a CSA, but it's really a subscription. So people sign up for a monthly meat subscription of a mix of beef, pork, and chicken, and it shows up on their door one way or another once a month. And that model has worked great for us. We really, really like it. It simplifies things a lot. And then from the silvopasture, just on the side of all of that, every year we plant hundreds or thousands of trees, mostly as future food for our animals. Yeah. So hazelnuts, apples, chestnuts, mulberries, oaks for hog feed for the future.
It's kind of aside from the pastures or integrated throughout the pastures. Like how do you do the spacing with that?
Integrated in the pastures.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. And I've experimented with a whole bunch of different strategies. Some worked, some didn't. It integrated in with it. Like I've got a one field set up for like, I don't know how long it's going to take to get to the point where it's ready, but one day it's going to be like my pig central area. And it's like and there's never been pigs there because I can't put pigs in there until it's ready. It's going to take probably another 10 years before it's ready. But once it's ready, I'll be able to cut my feed bill, grain bill for the pigs by, 50 or 75%.
Because the big pigs will eat like the acorns and
for at least the part of the year that it's productive. And I tried to put in as many species as I could to make it for as productive for as long of the chunk of the growing season as possible. So obviously early in the season, there's not going to be anything there, but.
And then how do we get more people doing this?
Well, I think, what Jason just said is like, that's not like a future possible scenario. That's like just the reality of the world we live in right now. Like fertilizer prices have exploded. Food insecurity is here. And so I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. One thing that brings me a little bit of optimism is that happened right at the peak of like the summer of 2020 and all that went down that summer. What I noticed, at least out here, is a fundamental shift, which is that people are starting to move out of the cities and move out on the landscape. And for the last 100 years, there's been this depopulation of the rural into the urban. And at some higher derivative, that shifted, and now it's starting to move back. And I don't know if that's a temporary phenomenon. My sense is that it won't be, that it's going to continue to happen, and that more and more people are coming out here because it's a safe place to be. We've got good water, we've got good soil, and people want to be food secure. They want to get out of the cities where they feel vulnerable and out into the country where they feel like they can actually grow some of their own food and be in a part of a community that might survive. And so I'm optimistic that has happened at this point before it's like super critical to where it's like too late to do anything about it. And so at this point, I think the real key, because there's lots of people like me out on the land that have like built a homestead, they produce all of their own food for their family, they're like locked in and solid. And now I think we're at a point where we need to start connecting with each other and building more community around that instead of just like, I mean, you need to have this phase where you're like focused on your own thing and you're getting your stuff together.
Yeah.
You know, you're just like figuring it out and you're like getting settled and you're essentially establishing roots into the land. Like we need to have rooted human beings on planet Earth. Like that's one of the key things of taking responsibility for being a keystone species is like becoming rooted into a place. So when I described our major reason for starting this farm and healing the ecosystems, I would say one thing I didn't mention, but was equally important, was a parallel notion, which was a personal notion of like, okay, I need to become a real human being. What does that even mean? Yeah. So like coming to the land with nothing, we bought vacant land and we had a backpacking tent and a little camp stove. And then it was just like, okay, me and my wife, and we like built a yurt, and then we got pregnant, and then I built a cabin. I got a sawmill and started cutting down trees so I could build a cabin. And then we lived in the cabin, then we had another kid and we had to build a bigger house. And so anyway, getting rooted on the land and figuring out like, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah. Like
in a real way, like not in this like artificially constructed reality that we've all grown up in, but like what at a fundamental, like, and so I think, you know, human beings need to kind of go through that process. They needed to figure out for themselves, what does it mean to be human? And I think that is part of the paradigm shift that we're all going to have to go through one way or another. Is just figuring that out for ourselves. So, and to me, that's like becoming rooted in a place. And then once you have your roots in the ground, using the forest metaphor, that's when the myceliums start to connect the different species of the trees via the roots, right? And so it only happens when you're rooted. Can you develop that kind of connection? And so we're in the process of like getting closer with other families that are out here. They've got land. They're growing their own food. They've developed roots here. They're not like, I'm going to be here for a little bit. I'm going to increase the value of my place and I'm going to sell it and I'm going to move to a better place. You know, like that's not the mentality. The mentality is like, I'm going to be here for the rest of my life and my kids are going to be here for their lives. And I'm going to work now so that my kids have some stuff to work with. When they get old enough, they're going to have a barn where they can put animals in, or they're going to have a shop where they can like build things in. Whereas we just started with vacant land. So I'm like investing all my time right now into like building infrastructure for future generations. Like, sure, I'll be able to use it for a little while, but that's not the intent. If it was just for me, I probably wouldn't bother, honestly, with a lot of the projects that I'm working on. Right. But, you know, having children and then going and thinking, you know, I try to think on like 100, 200 year timeframes. It's like not just about me. And, you know, maybe something will happen. Maybe an ice age will come. We'll have to move to Texas. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. But like, who cares? Like, the point is the mentality and the decision-making process of like planning on being in a place forever. Yeah. And when you do that, everything changes. Like your decision-making matrix of what's important shifts fundamentally once you've made the conscious decision, I'm going to be here forever.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
It's just so, it's so funny you say that. It's like literally everything we do. So I'm so glad we connected, because it's like I have a school, it's called Rhizoma Field School, based on the rhizome. Like the whole idea is like connecting horizontally, sharing resources. Almost everybody involved in Doomer Optimism is like interested, either homesteading or homestead curious. So that's cool. I really hope we stay connected and stay in touch. Any last thoughts? Anything we didn't ask you that you for sure want to say? I know you teach a course. Maybe you want to plug that. Other ways people can connect with you or like get involved with your project.
Sure. Yeah, we stopped using social media a couple years ago, which has been really nice, but then there's some downsides. I don't get to connect with as many people. But
the one time you were on Twitter for like
I was like, oh my god, I've been trying.
That was a fluke. I'm very happy that was a fluke.
Peter, you have got
I don't tweet at all, and I don't even know how your tweet popped up on my feed. Yeah, I just check it like once a week to like stay on top of some news. Right. And somehow your tweet about keystone species popped up, and I was like, I can't like not comment on this.
I know, and then Jason sent your tweet to me, and I was like, this is the guy I've been watching your YouTube videos whenever you like appear on some podcast, and I'm like, Jason, we have to talk to him. Listen, Peter, you should come on Twitter only sporadically, because we have a really good corner of Twitter that is not horrible.
Okay.
And people are actually like sharing resources and like posting like, oh, this is what I'm doing for my pig fencing. What do you guys have? This kind of stuff. So yeah.
Awesome.
If you come on, we'll steward you into a nice corner. But anyways,
okay.
Continue.
That sounds good. And so, yeah, but we do an email newsletter. That's kind of the way we keep in touch with folks, which you can sign up to on our website. That's mastodonvalleyfarm.com. And then I do teach courses. I taught ecology at UW for like 10 years. And so that was one thing I was like, I loved teaching. And so I was like, well, if I leave the university and start a farm, I'm going to keep teaching. So, but this is cool because I get to do it on my own terms. Like I don't have to use somebody else's syllabus. Like I just teach about what I think is important. And so basically it's evolved over the last decade into we started doing PDCs, permaculture design courses, and now it's called a regenerative farm design course. And basically half of it is like helping people figure out their personal context, because a lot of people, they're like, I want to start a farm. And then they look around, it's like, I want to start a farm like Joel Salatin. And they're looking for a recipe. They're looking for just like, okay, I just want an instructional manual of like how to do this. And farming is so
context dependent.
And so both on your physical, geophysical context, your social context, and your community and economic context, but then also your very personal, like what do you like to do in a day, right? Like I see a lot of people fail because they don't take into consideration their own personal context when they get started, and they end up doing something they don't like, and it doesn't work out. So anyway, we have this course where we guide people through this process of discovering their context, both personal and social and biophysical and economic, and then using all that information to turn into a design on the land for how to manage it and how to both physically manage the land and then economically set up the enterprises to support the family. So anyway, you can learn more. That's mastodonvalleyfarmschool.com. We do cohort classes, and they typically run about 3 months. We haven't done it in a while, but we're planning on starting another one probably in June. So if people are interested in that, they can sign up for the announcement at mastodonvalleyfarmschool.com.
And also, once you decide to run that cohort, come on Twitter and tag us so we can share it.
Cool, we'll do.
Anything else? Final question, Jason? Final thoughts?
No, I thought this was great. Yeah, that was a lovely conversation. Are there any questions that you wish somebody would ask you, that like in an interview that just hasn't been asked, and you're like, come on, people, like this is low hanging fruit here.
Yeah, well, I try not to go too long without mentioning things like the Younger Dryas catastrophe and the evolution of dinosaurs. And I was able to work that in, even though you didn't ask me about it. So, yeah. But one thing I do like to mention to people, because one comment that I get a lot from people is like, well, I don't have any land. Like there's nothing I can do. And my response is, like I kind of already mentioned it earlier, is that everyone is a keystone species of the land all the time, every single day, 3 times a day. And so if you don't have land to manage in like a regenerative or permaculture way, that's totally fine, but find your food from someone who does, because there's lots of people trying to do it that are struggling to find people to support them, to like eat their food. There's people growing nutrient dense food that are like showing up at farmers markets, or they've got a website and nobody's found them yet. And we really need to support these people that are like, we talked about this, you know, we're like maybe less than 1% of people producing food. We need something close to 10. We need millions of new farmers. And that's not negotiable. If we don't get 10 million new farmers in the next 50 to 100 years, we're done. Like we just have to do that. And so in order to start that process, we got to kickstart it. And in order to do that, it's up to all of us to find and support the people that are putting themselves out there and trying to figure out how to do it. Because you don't make any money farming. Like it's difficult to support yourself financially by farming. It's possible, but it's very difficult. And so I just encourage everyone to like buy as much of your food and think carefully about like what you're eating, and can you substitute that with something that you can buy locally from a farmer who's producing it or gathering it or whatever. I like to we don't eat any grains or anything like that, but a lot of people do. But you can start substituting those with like nuts and nut flour. You can make your own acorn meal. You can make your own hickory nut. And there are lots of old timers that go pick up hickory nuts off the ground and sell them at farmers markets. There are ways to and people can go to parks. I mean, parks are full of oak trees around here. Like nobody gathers them. Acorns were a staple crop for humans all over planet Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. It's only until 10,000 years ago, the Industrial Revolution, that we kind of forgot about acorns. So like I always encourage people to like go get some acorns, learn how to leach them in your sink and start trying to eat them. That's just a way, like an introductory way to start getting rooted into a place, is like eating food from that place. Like you can't be rooted in a place if you don't eat the food from there. So
do you have a website where you feel like there's the more or less comprehensive list of local farms? Do you like Local Harvest at all?
I haven't been on any of those websites in a long time.
Okay.
Local Harvest is one. I know there's quite a few that try to bring together and make those connections. Yeah. But like the ones I know about around here are like specific to our region. It's like nonprofits in this region that are connecting.
Might make sense for people to try to find, if they're like never got into this before, either just Google local farms near whatever city, or just go to your farmers markets and start talking to people.
Definitely go to farmers markets. I mean, the ironic thing is like I've never been to a farmers market. That's not the way we sell, and I don't usually suggest that people use that as a way of making money from their farm. But that's a great place to start. And yeah, I mean, that's the beautiful thing about, I mean, the internet and the time that we're in right now. Like the way we run our farm and the way we sell our product would have been impossible. Like we cut out all the middlemen.
Yeah.
I literally go out and help a baby cow be born. I raised it up for 2 years. I'm there when we shoot it. The guys take it in the truck and process it. I come back and put it in my freezer, and then I like drop it off on somebody's door. So that's never been possible before, outside of like a very historic context where it's like a village and everybody can do everything. But in the modern era, that's only possible recently because of the internet. Before that, I would have been subject to middlemen, and then the only way to survive would be to try to get like 1,000 acres and start a CAFO. I mean, that'd be the only way to economically make a farm work. And so we are in this really unique window of time where we still have a somewhat free internet, although that's starting to change, unfortunately. But we can find each other. And so anybody I also always am recommending people that are starting farms is to like have a website and tell your story, because that's the only way, that's the primary way that a lot of people are going to find you, whether you're at a farmer's market or not. But go to the farmer's market and do some extensive searches and just like talk to people. I mean, if you're in a rural area, like go to the local bar, go to church, and just talk to people like that. You gotta meet your neighbors. You gotta like know the people around you. That's just a part of it. So.
Well, Peter, thank you so much. This was such a lovely conversation. I'm so glad we connected. Like I said, I've been following your whole story and your whole arc. I think the first YouTube video I saw of you were having to go into town because your modem wasn't working because your home was too cold.
Probably, yeah.
It was like, no, I couldn't do this at home.
Not until last year did we have internet in a house. I didn't have it on the farm for 3 years, and I would have to go to a coffee shop 30 minutes away, and I would bring my like DeWalt tool battery charger, like plug it into the wall so I could go home and like keep working on my cabin with some power tools, and then like run my internet business like from the coffee shop. I think they got sick of me coming in there like, you're just gonna get coffee again and you're gonna be here for like 2 hours.
Use our electricity.
Right. But now we finally do have internet here, and so it's a lot.
You've entered into the first world, yeah.
We're transitioning. We're transitioning. We've been third world for a decade, and like I just set up a passive water system. So we've got spring water that I built like it's a complicated system, but it involves a ram pump and a bulk tank buried way up on a hill. And basically I've got spring water now coming into our house for the first time. So I'm pretty pumped.
So cool. That's so cool. Yeah, if I come to the US again, I live in Uruguay. If I come to the US again, I'm from Chicago. I would like to come visit if it's possible.
Yeah, of course. Anytime.
Okay, so yeah, thank you. That'll be the end. And then we were wondering whether or not we can cut it off here, whether or not you're connected with Mark Shepard.
I mean, I'm friends with him. We know each other. I don't see him that much.
Maybe he was another person. He's kind of on our list to come on. I don't know whether or not it would make sense to do an email introduction or something. I think I've emailed him before and he just didn't respond, but
he doesn't respond.
Okay.
I mean, it's not going to matter if I'm on that email or not. I could try.
That's cool. Yeah, he's great too. It's so cool that you're friends with him and you guys are like, yeah, little brain trust over there. I think there's something, I don't know. I'm really, really interested in the potential for getting people who have like been through the whole decade-long process of becoming rooted to like help other people, like your course, but maybe events, I don't know, maybe work bioregional field schools or something like that is something Jason and I talk about a lot. So yeah, anyways,
I'm Southern Appalachia, so I've lived here for a couple of years, and I'm also like, okay, gonna be here forever, gonna try and be here forever, multi-generational, let's see what Southern Appalachia can do. But the Driftless seems like you guys have something special going on, so that's amazing.
Yeah. We it's a special place. We really like it. It's a great place to raise kids.
Yeah, and I think Appalachia has something similar, which is like industrial like tilling ag doesn't do great there. So you've got a little culture that kind of never went away, where it just
little mountain valleys.
Yeah,
there's a lot of similarities between the Driftless area and a lot of parts of Appalachia for sure, or the Ozarks for that matter. But it's there's a book called The Art of Not Being Governed by James C. Scott. And basically he makes this whole philosophical explanation of why difficult terrain locations are basically the only places where humans can survive in a way that's not complete, like they're not completely slaves of the state.
Right. One of the reasons I love being here.
All right. Yeah. Anarchists unite.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll let you go. Yeah, we'll tag you on Twitter, and I'll send you an email once this actually gets released. It'll be a couple weeks. We have a little bit of a backlog, but sure. Yeah, I hope we can stay in touch. This was such a pleasure.
Yeah, it was a blast.
Yeah.
Cool.
Nice to meet you guys.
Thanks,
yeah.
Peter.
Yeah. Take care.